I asked Patreon supporters for questions and they delivered. In this Q&A video, we cover a wide-ranging spread of topics including Ukraine, population, climate change, Scottish independence, China, nuclear war, equal opportunities and kittens. I may have made one of those up. Lots to discuss, let's jump straight in. Hi Mallen, you say you don't usually like to make predictions, but I noticed you've made some, so I'm asking you to make a big one. Who's going to win the Russia-Ukraine war? Well, I'll do that, but my point is that I usually don't make predictions because they're pretty worthless unless they're based on some sort of inside knowledge that gives a more reliable insight into likelihoods. And the other class of predictions tends to be that people will make predictions based on what they want to happen rather than what's likely to happen. I will at least do the opposite to that one here because my preference is that Ukraine wins and that Putin, Russia and the rest of the world learns that invading your neighbour does not, in the modern world, bring you rewards. That's my preference, not least because it's just, but also because it's more likely to deter future similar adventures. If Putin retains new territory after this, then it will be just a matter of time before he comes back for more. That's the fear in any case. But unfortunately, my prediction is that Putin will win the war, at least at a base level. The odds favour it at the moment. I don't think it'll achieve what he hoped in terms of the restoration of glory to Russia in a world where the exercise of power is the defining feature of great sovereign nations. But that is a different question. If I look at the potential scenarios, it is more likely that Russia bludgeons its way into control of the areas that it's focusing on right now. It then threatens to keep going, which increases the pressure via restricting gas availability and all the rest of it. So that means the Europeans will then break ranks to encourage peace at whatever price in order to make the pain on their own economies stop. America and Britain will start to balk at the cost of sending endless ammunition and weapons, and also they begin to realise they need larger stocks of both of those for themselves than they'd realised they did before the war played out. Ukraine runs out of ammunition and weapons and then has little option but to negotiate a peace. That is the most likely outcome based on the current dynamics. Now, it won't be exactly as cut and dried as that, but the dynamic will be as I described it. Those dynamics could change. Russia has a resource problem of its own, and its large superiority of weapons could be more time limited than we think. It could come grinding to a halt. Its economy could suffer worse than expected, and it could lead to action against Putin in a way that currently seems unlikely, notwithstanding the early wishful thinking on the subject we saw in many places. Putin could die from whatever illness he's covering up, although it depends on who replaces him, and it's not going to be an enlightened Democrat, I'm guessing. And look, I will be delighted to be wrong about any of that. I have no stake in his prediction, which is why I wouldn't have made it, except for the fact that you asked me directly. If the Europeans hold firm in deed as well as in word, and if America particularly can stay the course, then the tide could definitely be turned. There is everything to play for. It's easier for Russia to destroy a city than it is for them to hold it in the long term. If the West is as robust as it claims to be, then all bets could be off. I just think that Putin has less exposure and more patience than they do. He's following a strategy and they are reacting and also beginning to fight amongst themselves. I'm sure in their minds they would say that if they get peace at any price this time, well, that will buy them time to be more prepared next time. Will they be, though? Bearing in mind that both sides learn lessons, not just one, and both sides can get better and be more prepared next time. Get it right this time, and there shouldn't be a next time. But it will be uncomfortable, and we've all gotten rather a bit too used to being comfortable. So there you go. That's my unhappy prediction. Let's hope I'm wrong. There have been more calls for a Scottish referendum. What are your thoughts on Scottish independence? Is our kingdom stronger united? Do the Scots get a raw deal? So, for non-UK viewers, this is the determination of the Scottish Nationalist Party to hold another referendum on Scottish independence. They announced a date recently in 2023 that they'd like it to take place, although it's almost certainly not going to be ruled legal. The last referendum on the question was in 2014. The no vote was 55%, the yes vote was 45%. The British government refuses to permit another referendum on the grounds that they had one recently. The result was clear. And you can't sensibly just keep coming back and back over and over again for another bite, especially when last time it was said that this would be a once-in-a-generation exercise. Such claims as that quickly get forgotten by the losing sides in referenda, unsurprisingly. So, what are my thoughts on Scottish independence? Look, and I think I've said this before, I believe in self-determination for all people. If it becomes the settled will of the people of Scotland that they wanted to go independent, then ultimately that should become reality, of course. Personally, I think Great Britain is stronger as a solid political entity, and I would regret its breakup. But it would be their decision, and I wouldn't be a campaigner in that referendum. Right now, the polls show that it's not the current reality. And I say settled will because questions of nationhood shouldn't be something that comes as a light whim based on current political controversies. So lots of people in Scotland despise Boris Johnson and think his government is incompetent. There's a fair case to be made on that score, but that shouldn't be what drives a permanent decision that would have huge irreversible consequences. Not least because, as the death of 1,000 cuts seems to be accelerating to its conclusion this week, may not be the case for much longer. No doubt the Scottish nationalists won't approve much of whoever replaces him either, but that's a party political thing. Now look, an independent Scotland will have terrible leaders of its own. From time to time, the SNP, with its huge majority, with all the complacency and corruption that tends to follow such majorities, I'm betting they'll provide some of them. So it has to be about more than just that. On a practical basis, I think Scots would be mad to do it. The vast majority of their trade is with the rest of the UK. If you thought the effects of Brexit were negative, and the SNP certainly make that case, well, just wait till you see what happens to Scotland if there's a hard border between Scotland and England. And there would have to be such a border if Scotland fulfilled its intent to rejoin the EU. You asked, do the Scots get a raw deal? Well, no. My understanding is that Westminster transfers a lot more resources into Scotland than comes back out. It would take a solid hit if it left. But like Brexit, countries may sometimes rationally choose the economically harder path in the name of national identity and integrity. And that would be fair enough. If they had an honest analysis of likely consequences and they were able to face up to the inevitable fear-mongering the other side would be whipping up all over them, if they faced all of that and said, we hear you, but we believe this is a price we are prepared to pay to be united as one nation, then fair enough. Right now, there's no sign that that's the position of the Scottish people, not in the current opinion polls. So you might ask yourself, what are the political calculations being made by the SNP in pushing for another referendum at this point, if it's likely to be lost? We're not mind readers, so we don't know for sure. Recent events would certainly incentivise a degree of distracting attention, coupled maybe with a realisation that this is probably a high point for SNP support, so if not now, then when? In the context of pending food shortages, should global exports to China be restricted while they maintain exceptionally high levels of grain reserves? In a world where actions can have large unintended consequences, I would be cautious of jumping to conclusions that would push you to that radical a course of action. Cutting off food imports to a country, it's one of the most aggressive actions you could take against them, short of declaring war. And particularly since we've had indications from China that its 2022 harvest is in trouble. China's agricultural minister admitted, and the admission itself is pretty unusual because normally China doesn't disclose when it has problems. He said the wheat harvest could be the worst in history because of the heavy rainfall last autumn that delayed planting. China's wheat harvest is the largest in the world. So that matters in a year where we see constraints elsewhere because of a war, for instance. Yes, Beijing's policy has been to keep plentiful stockpiles, which we should be thankful for, and perhaps ponder whether maybe in future years we should go some way towards emulating it. China, unlike many Asian countries, only imports less than 10% of its annual demand. It still is large volumes because that represents a huge population. And China's policy has been to try to reduce its imports, precisely because it wants to reduce vulnerability to global events. I think more of a challenge of a growing food crisis is not so much about targeting China, but the simple fact that growing numbers of countries are putting and will put export bans in place for any food that they produce. The high prices that will drive on the food that is traded will further discourage countries from buying what they don't need. I think the challenge will be much more about how that plays out in the poorest countries than it is about anything else. It's not a dilemma that would be solved by singling out China. Indeed, the political destabilisation that comes with that would probably make things a lot worse than they already are. And in terms of the total amount of grain worldwide, probably wouldn't make that much difference anyway. China will happily buy Russia's grain, including the parts of it that actually belong to Ukraine, if they need to. Hello, Mr. Baker. Elderly curmudgeons, such as myself, tend to view the current generation of leaders as being politically inept and or administratively incompetent compared to previous eras. Do you think this is objectively true? Or has the internet and a news media that is both more polarised and less deferential exaggerated flaws that were always present? Interesting question. It's hard to argue with the ineptness of the current generation of political leaders, but there's certainly a danger we could be suffering from recency bias in thinking that it's so much worse than usual. I don't think we are, because there are indications that minimum expected standards have been degraded. So there have always been incompetent and unethical and corrupt political figures. The question is, what happens to them and how quickly? The Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher had a leader who upheld high standards of personal behaviour, and when her ministers fell short on various scores, mostly they would have to resign. There were the occasional ones whose flaws were tolerated in second-level positions because of their usefulness and the fact the flaws were not too egregious, but the tolerance would usually run out with the second offence. Now we have a Prime Minister who everyone around him acknowledges simply won't resign in circumstances that unquestionably would have done for his predecessors. We have become used to the fact that he just lies. We have become used to the fact that he is chaotically organised and he puts weak people around him so that nobody overshadows him. And he retains support from people who are prepared to discount all of those things, so long as they think he remains an electoral asset. That's now running out. But it used to be taken as read that you couldn't be such an asset with the British people if you lacked integrity. In this increasingly populist age, those standards seem to have genuinely broken down. I remain convinced that throughout most of my adult life, the majority of British elections have been won or lost on competence, not on politics. There are 2 or 3 exceptions, but most elections had an obviously competent person versus an obviously incompetent person. And while that wasn't clear to partisans who make themselves willfully blind to the faults on their own side and the merits on the other side, the voters in the centre, who are the ones who switch, largely always seem to go with competence. It's been the same in America. You only have to look in the comment sections of my most recent video to see how partisans will be fiercely blind to the failings of their preferred candidates, which gives them license to break norms without consequence, those candidates. We get the politicians we deserve. If we tolerate low standards so long as people are on our team, then we will get worse and worse leaders on average, with the occasional lucky exception that we won't deserve. Now, all of that said, I would also add that part of the administrative incompetence comes because of the growth of the state, the huge bureaucracies, and the expectations that government provides so many of the answers to so many of the problems. That actually is a promise it's impossible to fulfill. Competence comes with a clearer view of the limitations of your role and your powers. So that's not purely down to the calibre of individual politicians, but it puts their failings into sharper relief. Hi, All the media coverage of global warming focuses solely on how bad it's going to be. But have you come across any studies or summaries that show the other side of the equation? It's impossible to believe that there can only be downsides to higher temperatures. Indeed, although the higher the temperatures get, the more that changes. I covered some of this in the video I did a while ago on Bjorn Lomborg. When it comes to deaths from extreme weather, the studies do show that in the current time, the likely reductions of deaths from cold extremes are larger than the increases in deaths from hot extremes. And it's one of the valid complaints about the mainstream media coverage of climate change that often the hot weather deaths are cited in isolation and out of context. However, that's all based on current day impacts or expected near-term impacts. Those same studies show, and this makes intuitive sense, that as warming progresses into the future, you will get diminishing returns from a reduction in cold weather deaths and increasing damage from increases in hot weather deaths. All of that, though, as usual, is based on trends that ignore any adjustments and adaptation that we might make. Improvements in air conditioning availability in the poorer countries most exposed to hot extremes would reduce the number of expected deaths. But let's not pretend, though, that it would make them zero. We have known for centuries how to prevent cold weather deaths, and yet they still happen in significant numbers, because human organisation is rarely optimised, particularly for impacts on the poorest communities, those that can't afford proper heating or in the future air conditioning. So look, I can understand why some commentators don't go into the positives. They see the danger that people will presume that climate change is a great thing if they only look at those current day figures, while all of the expectations are that those benefits will diminish over time. The same with the benefits to crop growth of enhanced CO2 levels. There are certain crops that will benefit short term, but increasing temperatures reduce, then eliminate and then reverse those benefits for most crops. I understand, but I don't agree with that viewpoint. I think people should be trusted to be able to handle transparency about short-term impacts and long-term expectations. Sure, some of those who want to persuade everyone it's all a big hoax, they will seize on such figures and use them. So what? I mean, they do that anyway. Treating people like adults will be more likely to improve trust when you're arguing the other case. And speaking of such figures, an old topic is back. I generally take the claims of Tony Heller with a large grain of salt and reject many of his claims and opinions and political preferences. Me too. Now this next question, oh wait, I hear a but coming. But his frequent demonstrations of how terrible historical and prehistorical but geologically recent droughts and floods and heat waves and hurricanes and tornadoes and famines were, back when CO2 levels were lower than Greta or Al Gore ever dreams of seeing them again, seem persuasive to me. Okay, but have you not noticed why you find them to be persuasive? He throws in his historical facts alongside the implied assertions that the so-called alarmists claim that basically there's never been bad or extreme weather in the past. If you swallow that planted fake suggestion, then all of the facts of historical bad weather then come across as very persuasive, because of course, yes, there has been bad weather in the past. Like a magician, he draws your attention to the verifiable facts, while unseen the sleight of hand was to persuade you they somehow prove or disprove something. The fake bit is the assertion that anybody, say for a few fringe figures, has ever said bad weather didn't happen in the past. Tony Heller's technique involves slipping in innuendo about what they want you to believe and what they are seeking to achieve. That sets up the straw man, which can easily be shot down. Now the questioner adds more. TH's evidence that the historical land surface temperature records have been consistently adjusted in the same direction, making the past cooler and the present warmer, seems pretty persuasive. We do know, though, that things can seem persuasive and yet be wrong, don't we? Why do you think that all the adjustments have gone in the same direction? Because that's what he told you? And you think he's a neutral and reliable narrator on this. Why? Because all the graphs he showed you went in that direction? Do we think there might be other graphs? Because no, it's not true. Some results go in one direction, some go in the other, depending on the adjustments that are being made, what changes they are correcting for. It's just that he only shows you one set, while once again planting innuendo that what you're seeing is tampering with nefarious intent. So he usually shows land temperatures in the United States. You should smell a rat because we're talking about global warming. Clues in the name, land and sea, the whole world. Here's just one graph covering land and sea temperature input data. The dotted line is raw unadjusted temperatures. The blue line is the NASA homogenized one, adjusted for historical changes that would affect the comparability of the data. The effect of changes since 1940 onwards has been to reduce the amount of cooling, not to increase it. And whichever line you take, none of it interferes with what is an obvious, clear trend. The number of graphs that can show the opposite are few in number and very specific about what they are actually showing. Various characters will tell you that those are the one true measure and come up with various lame reasons as to why you should pay attention to them and not to all of the other graphs. Anyone who only shows you a carefully selected dataset, and by sheer coincidence all the other datasets happen to show the opposite of what they're trying to persuade you of, it's down to you whether or not you find that persuasive. Focus on the whole of what's being planted in your head, not just the bits that have graphs attached. All the graphs you mentioned show is that adjustments were made, something that nobody disputes. The innuendo without proof that puts the idea in your head that this was malicious and that it made the data less representative of reality, not more representative of reality. You often mention that you first became political with the CND as the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Do nuclear weapons worry you less now? Many commentators say we are still in great peril, yet it isn't as fashionable to be concerned as it was. If children want a plausible reason to think they might not grow old, surely this is a better bet than global warming. It got me involved with issue activism. I remained unattracted by and kind of naive to the politics of it at that point. In the 1980s, we were on a hair trigger. The Cold War was at its height. Both sides had a policy of mutually assured destruction, massive nuclear strikes to be launched at almost a moment's notice if you thought the other side had launched a preemptive strike against you. We now know there were several points where we came absurdly close to blowing it all up. Like the false alarm the Russians got suggesting a strike had been launched against them, and the operative concerned made the judgment it was wrong and did not report it the way he was supposed to. One person's judgment about a computer error stood between us and genuine nuclear Armageddon. So yeah, it was kind of rational for us to be concerned and morally revolted at the time. Even as CND's policy response, unilateral disarmament was not necessarily the right response. Today we run the risk that we have started to envisage the use of nuclear warheads as battlefield weapons. On the one hand, that's better than all-out strategic assault leading to global destruction and death. On the other, it lowers the bar that would have dissuaded the crossing of the threshold in the first place. If Russia starts to lose in Ukraine, it might well see the use of a nuclear warhead or two as a way of reversing the flow without going into an all-out exchange. That would be bad, obviously, in its own terms. Even battlefield nuclear weapons should not be contemplated if we have an ounce of sanity left. But then, of course, you still have the additional risk of escalation and that you end up with that all-out nuclear war following quickly behind anyway. Is that a more urgent issue than climate change? The political situation is urgent, yes. But we have to now accept that we have the technology to destroy ourselves in an increasing number of ways. Disinventing the weapons isn't possible, it isn't the issue, it's dealing with the geopolitical crises in a competent, strategic way, while seeking to regain a global consensus about our mutual interest in establishing a line beyond which we do not cross. That's our most urgent challenge of this current time. If we get it wrong, it goes extremely bad very quickly. Unfortunately, climate change doesn't go away just because we have short-term problems. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. But I would hesitate to draw this to the attention of young people. They have been wrestling with quite enough anxiety, and I've been consistent in saying that adults should be more focused on solving these problems rather than terrifying children with them. To children, I would point to the fact that we have come through such challenges numerous times before, and we are good at it. So while it's serious and we won't be complacent about that history, they should be aware of it, of course, but they should ignore the apocalyptic rhetoric and focus on preparing for their best adult life. It is, after all, the thing that they can control which will improve their life chances, regardless of what history throws at them. Hi, Mallen. Do you think that we should care about boys being underrepresented in further education? If we assume boys to be equally capable as girls, it looks like fully 1/3 of boys who could be at university are for some reason disengaged. Why isn't anyone talking about this? To be clear, girl-to-boy ratio at undergrad is 3:2. Honestly, I don't care in the slightest about the wholly natural and expected fact that different people are attracted in different percentages to certain life choices. The key question when faced with this sort of disparity is simply, why is it happening? Is there some obstacle or barrier to opportunity that is genuinely discriminating against someone? A lot of the activists presume that if there's a disparity in outcomes, then it must be because of some sort of discrimination, and in any specific case, it may be true. You have to consider it as one of the possibilities when you investigate with an open mind. But often it seems that it simply isn't. Boys and girls, certainly on average, make different choices. So long as they're free to make those choices and they're encouraged to see the full range of possibilities that are open to them, then why would we be that interested? Now, of course, you will then get some careers that don't attract enough people that they need because everyone freely choosing for themselves doesn't neatly fall into just the right numbers of people going to all the right places. So there's a place for seeking to sell certain choices actively and positively to people. But I would say that would be on the basis of need, rather than some explicitly ideological position that says the intake of one specific decision, i.e. university, should look exactly like the overall demographics of the country. I don't see why we should expect or demand that it should look like the overall demographic of the country, so long as you are not using that as an excuse for genuine covert discrimination. Who are your favourite economists? I rarely have favourites of anything, actually, and I use the work of economists to try to understand the world. I don't promote a specific economic perspective per se. That said, I think on the historical front, Joseph Schumpeter, who coined the phrase creative disruption, is underrated for the impact that he had on thinking in the post-war years. And of living economists, I find insights from various places, from Daniel Kahneman on the one hand to Thomas Sowell on the other. And I'm always interested to review interesting schools of thought and insightful individuals, so add your own suggestions in the comments if you have some to make. Now, a slightly shortened question. The latest census for England and Wales shows an increase of 3.5 million since 2012, mostly from immigration. Population Matters 2018 YouGov poll shows that 74% of the population want a population policy. Why do more or less all politicians of all parties fight shy of attending to all of this? For a couple of reasons. One, as soon as you go onto population questions, a bunch of people will start accusing you of wanting to restrict immigration because of pandering to racists, or indeed for the politicians that are actually being racist themselves. And that's before you even get to the growing band of people who have swallowed conspiracy theories about people actually aiming to reduce populations through nefarious means. I mean, that last one's less of a factor, but even so. So even when they want to address the issue, they do so in the manner of handling a primed explosive device, because they do not want to get labelled as racist. Two, because a short-termist politician can often persuade themselves it's a long-term problem, which can be kicked down the road for the next person to solve. As we've often seen in the past, politicians will be reluctant to risk their own political capital for something that could, without consequence to themselves, be left to someone else. It's all down to political incentives and the calibre of politicians in being prepared to take risks. And three, in the UK, we've had lots of jobs that Brits seem not to want to do, so the short-term rationale for permitting a degree of immigration to fill the needy jobs is very high on the economic front. In recent months, we saw a huge amount of food waste in May, likely going to see it same again in autumn, because the number of immigrant workers has been cut for various reasons, including Brexit. We also saw a big shortfall of truck drivers post-pandemic. Those sorts of shortages, the real problems that they create, keep up the pressure to allow immigration, whether that's the ideal long-term policy or not. Incompetent politicians will lurch towards easy answers when the heat is on. Immigration is seen as good for society if it means economic growth. It only goes wrong if you get cultural mismatches and local areas changing so rapidly, the indigenous residents feel that their world is disappearing before their very eyes. Those people who responded to that poll you mentioned were seeing population as a cultural phenomenon, not one about the maths of human numbers. And it's in that area where it has all the explosive power that politicians feel like they should treat it as though it were a dangerous dog. Hi Mallen. The Jackdaw gas field east of Aberdeen has been given the green light, even though it was previously rejected, October 21, on environmental grounds. Shell has said that they will capture more CO2, but it is still questionable from an environmental standpoint. Does the government prioritising energy security at this time make sense? Yes, we have an energy crisis and it's hitting all households. Environmentalists who are focused on solely one variable may dismiss that as irrelevant, but you will lose support for climate policies extremely fast if they are pursued to the impoverishment of ordinary people. Besides, even if the government was successfully following every line in its net zero policy, which is not, we would be expecting to continue to use natural gas in this country for the next couple of decades as we're switching sources in a managed way. Germany's shown how not to do it, and it's having to ramp up its fossil fuel use significantly as a result. I think it was the CEO of Shell who pointed out at the time of COP26, if you reduce the supply of fossil fuels before you've reduced the demand for fossil fuels, you just push prices up. The Jackdaw field will provide 6.5% of the gas that the UK needs. It's in our national interest to get as much of the gas we need domestically than on the international market. Doesn't mean it gives us license to use it for longer than it's necessary in a well-managed, orderly transition. But ignoring that we're not living in an orderly world has to be part of that. You have to be able to cope with contingencies that the world throws at you, not just think you can follow a plan that assumes stability. If you manage the transition badly, if you send the message to people you're allowing them to suffer from huge costs, partly because you're ideologically committed to net zero, you will lose their support and hence their permission to follow those policies. This week we've seen go-slow motorway protests from some over the price of fuel. When people are suffering, they will hit out at whatever they think is to blame. So yes, being seen to prioritise energy security and reducing hardship is exactly what the government needs to be doing. Another shortened question. Hi Mallen, what do you think of Justin Trudeau, specifically as regards the continued incarceration of Pat King, the recent rearrest of Tamara Lick on grounds of her breaking bail conditions, his desire to force third vaccines on all Canadians wishing to travel, even internally, come September, and his admiration for China? How did this clown ever get elected? Ha! That's what's known as something of a leading question. Look, I try not to make pronouncements on people per se. Mostly I talk about behaviours that I do or don't like. People often don't notice the difference because if I criticise the behaviour of someone, they will accuse me of having labelled them as bad or an evil person, which I generally don't. In the case of Trudeau, I'm going to be straight here and say I do not follow Canadian politics enough in sufficient detail to make a rounded judgment. I note a number of people whose judgment I tend to respect who are extremely down on Trudeau, and I certainly concurred with their criticism of how the trucker convoy was handled. I also don't agree with vaccine mandates, as you know. I know those have been relaxed recently, but they were framed in a way that I think has proven extremely divisive in Canada. I note that whatever he said about China in the past, he has been critical of them recently, and relations between the two countries have been going down as a result. Some of that's because of the arrest of the Huawei CFO, which was at America's request, but not all. So I would want to look in detail at what he said there and what the actual policies have been. Look, I know I would get plenty of brownie points from many of the viewers on this channel if I just slated him. He's certainly following a policy agenda I wouldn't support in many aspects, but I don't take against people as individuals just because I disagree with some of their policies. I can respect people of good faith who I thoroughly disagree with. People are so vitriolic against their political opponents, they never, as a matter of principle, allow that they might be acting in good faith. And maybe in this case they're right, I'm just not inclined to take that unless I know more. Meanwhile, I will take your question as a prompt to start paying more attention to Canadian politics so I can give a more satisfactory answer next time somebody asks me that question. Hi Mallen, the newest myth is that we're running out of soil. Despite most areas have 100 foot, at worst soil quality at top degrades a bit. It makes greens look silly when, say, all things fail in 50 years. This is a reference to a claim that there's only a set number of harvests left. Sometimes it's 60, sometimes it's 30 or 50. It's actually not a new claim, it's been around for more than a decade. I've certainly mentioned it before on this channel some time ago. It's one of these claims that appears in a blog with a reference, but then people don't check the reference. They repeat the claim as though it's a fact, and then it becomes a known piece of wisdom that circulates and circulates but has the unfortunate quality of not being true. Because ultimately some actual journalist was indeed curious enough to trace the sources back. The reference given did not support the claim, and no soil scientist would credit the claim as being based on reality. Now, you shouldn't lunge to the other extreme and assume there's no problem with soil erosion. In a number of parts of the world, it is a real problem. A lot of companies and agriculturists are looking at how farming practices could become more regenerative to ensure that soil health and fertility is retained. Others are arguing for a less dramatic shift from the traditional practices that got us here. It's still very much a live debate. But you shouldn't believe the green ideologues who suggest that the only way is to revert to traditional organic agriculture, which would bring significantly reduced yield and which is based on faith and false figures like the number of harvests that we have left. But again, just because that solution isn't the best one, it doesn't mean the problem isn't a real one. All right. My thanks to the Patreon supporters who asked questions for this episode. Apologies to those who, for whatever reason, your questions could not be included. And all that leaves certain other questions unasked and unanswered, such as, will Boris Johnson still be Prime Minister by the time I do the end of week news roundup this week? I think so, but there are certainly some convinced that he won't make it that far. Join me for the roundup on Friday, where we'll be able to reflect on whatever has happened in the meantime. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.